being with us in this early hour of the day, although it's not that early. But thrilled to kickstart the second day of our Odesa debates. We have a star panel to start the Thursday. Very thrilled indeed to welcome our speakers and our guests. Thank you very much for that. But first things first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Pandelis, who will say a few words in Greek and introduce our speakers for today. So Mr. Boumbouras, there is simultaneous translation, of course.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλημέρα. Σήμερα δεύτερη μέρα του συνεδρίου.
Today is the second day of the conference.
Εμείς οι Έλληνες σε όλο τον πλανήτη
We, the Greeks who live on the whole planet,
είμαστε περήφανοι γιατί ένας δικός μας άνθρωπος είναι αντιπρόεδρος της Ευρωπαϊκής Επιτροπής.
we're especially proud of our Greek person who holds a very serious office. He is the Vice President of the European Commission.
Τον έχουμε κοντά μας σήμερα, εδώ στην Αγία Πόλη της Οδυσσού. Για μας η Οδυσσός είναι Αγία Πόλη.
And we're very glad that he is here today with us in this saint city. Odesa is a sacred city for us.
Γιατί από εδώ ξεκίνησε πριν 200 χρόνια.
Because this is the place where 200 years ago,
Η ιδέα απελευθέρωσης της Ελλάδας από τον Οθωμανικό Ζυγό.
the idea of independence of the Greek state from Ottoman Empire was born.
Εύχομαι καλή συνέχεια και προσκαλώ τον νομάρχη της περιφερείας της Οδυσσού, κύριο Hrynevetsky.
I would like to wish you a fruitful conference, and I would like to pass the floor to the governor of Odesa Oblast, Mr. Hrynevetsky.
Доброго дня, шановні пані і панове. Дуже радий вітати всіх вас на Одещині. За останній час Одещина перетворилась на центр міжнародних подій регіонального і не тільки регіонального виміру. Мені дуже приємно, що присутня така поважна аудиторія, і ми обговорюємо питання майбутнього нашої держави України. Говорячи про майбутнє, ми дійсно повинні думати про стратегію розвитку. І така стратегія розвитку визначена президентом України Володимиром Зеленським в документі, яка називається «Стратегія національної безпеки України. Стратегія людського розвитку». Говорячи про безпекові питання, я хотів би зосередити увагу перш за все на тому, що наш регіон в сучасних умовах знаходиться на передовій безпекових питаннях, і в обороноздатності нашої держави займає особливе місце. Тому що тут зосереджена вся військова компонента, тут зосереджені всі сили забезпечення обороноздатності. І для регіонального рівня це серйозна робота по створенню сучасної інфраструктури, яка б надала можливість розбудові сучасних військово-морських сил нашої держави. Ви, як ніхто, відчуваєте, наскільки гостро стоять питання в Чорноморському регіоні. Чорноморський регіон сьогодні перетворяється, як ми говоримо, на геополітичне казино. І завдання місцевої влади сьогодні консолідувати всі можливості, починаючи від інтелектуальних, фінансових, матеріальних ресурсів, для того, щоб забезпечити стабільність і правопорядок. І для цього президент поступово втілює в життя свої ініціативи через такі програми, як «Велике будівництво». Велике будівництво – це не тільки будівництво об'єктів соціальної сфери, а в першу чергу будівництво інфраструктури, яка б змогла захистити нашу державу. Це і будівництво сучасних автомобільних доріг, мостів, енергонезалежність. І, що дуже важливо, це перспективні питання облаштування на державному кордоні. Одещина сьогодні має 400 кілометрів необлаштованого кордону з невизнаним Придністров'ям. У нас буквально вчора відбулася дуже плідна розмова з пані Стефанишиною, віце-прем'єр-міністром України, в столиці українського Придністров'я Ізмаїлі, де ми обговорювали питання участі України з 1 листопада в головуванні стратегії Євросоюзу Дунайського регіону. Ми бачаємо там доволі серйозні перспективні проекти, в першу чергу по відновленню роботи українського Дунайського пароплавства, використання інфраструктури морських портів Hrynevetsky, Ізмаїл, Усть-Дунайськ, питання пов'язані з оновленням флоту, питання пов'язані з будівництвом сучасних гідротехнічних споруд, активізацією роботи переправи Орловка і Сарча, яка створює унікальні можливості для розвитку 7-го транспортного коридору, перевезення вантажів з країн Скандинавії, Балтії на Балкани і Туреччину. Амбітний проєкт, який ми вчора визначили, має стати результатом, знову ж таки, безпекових питань. В першу чергу, зайнятість населення, створення сучасної інфраструктури, цифровізація, діджиталізація. Буквально на днях відбудеться Конгрес місцевих і регіональних влад під головуванням президента України, і відбудеться він в Одесі, де ми будемо розглядати стратегію розвитку Одеського регіону. Стратегія, знову ж таки, передбачає комплекс дій, які будуть поліпшувати якість життя населення. Це в першу чергу якість питної води, це питання екології, це питання облаштування транспортних коридорів, це будівництво сучасної Одеси. І в програмі «Велике будівництво» президент запропонував програму «Велика реставрація». Реставрація пам'яток архітектури нашого міста з тим, щоб Одещина дійсно стала унікальним туристичним магнітом. Говорячи про майбутнє і погляд у майбутнє, Одеська обласна державна адміністрація разом з Одеською міською радою дала пропозиції уряду. Я щиро вдячний уряду України за те, що він підтримав нашу ідею з тим, щоб саме Одеса стала центром проведення Експо 2030. 15 жовтня ми через посла України у Франції подали заявку на участь в цьому амбітному проєкті. Ми будемо змагатись з Москвою, Російською Федерацією, з Римом, Італією, з Південною Кореєю. Але якщо подивитись в минуле, то в кожній цій країні проходили такі заходи. І я дуже сподіваюся на те, що одеські дебати, представництво широке, максимально нас підтримує в цьому плані. Бо вибори і визначення будуть прийматися в липні 23-го року. І мені буде дуже приємно, якщо це буде прийнято саме за каденцію і президента Зеленського, і діючого уряду, і Верховної Ради. До 30-го року ще є час, але ми готові взяти на себе цю відповідальність з тим, щоб забезпечити сучасну інфраструктуру для проведення потужної виставки Експо 2030. Шановні колеги, говорячи про сучасний стан, ви знаєте, що в нашій державі проходять амбітні реформи. І одна із потужних реформ, яку ми безпосередньо, регіональні лідери, втілюємо в життя, це реформа адміністративно-територіальна і децентралізація. Звичайно, що це потужний крок вперед на шляху до демократії, але ми бачаємо тут певні проблеми, і з багатьма з вас я зустрічався, і прошу підтримки, прошу поради саме для того, як створити потужні громади, як створити їх самодостатніми, як збалансувати повноваження і відповідальність. Тому що паралельно пішла і земельна реформа, одна із найважливіших. Іде судова реформа. Да, не так, як хотілося б, але вона просувається вперед. Але мені здається, що основним викликом сьогодні для того, щоб Україна дивилась в майбутнє, є все ж таки внутрішні питання, питання виборчої системи, питання правонаступності влади. І якщо в конституційному вимірі ми зможемо ці питання і проблеми врегулювати, я переконаний, що це буде потужне підґрунтя, фундамент для того, щоб ми могли дійсно з надією дивитись на перспективу. Я вбачаю для себе 3 ключові слова, які можуть стати таким девізом для того, щоб Україна дійсно дивилась вперед і стала процвітаючою країною. Для цього ми маємо мати потужну розвитку, вкладати кошти в науку і мати терпіння. Дякую за увагу.
Thank you, Mr. Governor. We move straight away with our panel, Ukraine at 30, a vision for a peaceful and prosperous future. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the moderator for today, David Herszenhorn, Brussels Chief Correspondent at Politico Europe. David, the panel welcomes.
In your person. Good morning. We'll just give them a moment to take the podium so we can see you. It makes the Vice President nervous. He's familiar behind the lectern. So good morning. I'm David Herszenhorn, the Chief Brussels Correspondent with Politico Europe. Thank you for being up bright and early for this first panel. As you notice on the agenda, some of the questions for today's panel are quite similar to some of the questions from yesterday and some of the questions that we've been talking about for years from Ukraine. So thinking about how to make this different, I'll warn you, one of the things I always say about the role of journalists is that we keep it real. We hold up mirrors and force folks to confront hard truths. And I think we're in for a treat today because we're not supposed to admit this, but some of our panelists are among my favorite politicians. Reporters are not supposed to say that, but even though as journalists we're objective, we're not objective when it comes to truth versus disinformation. And we have panelists who tell it like it is, which would be refreshing and great. And just to start, because this is what reporters do, I want to tell you a story about an event that Politico hosted in Brussels just at the beginning of September. You know, in Brussels, the rentrée back to school is a big deal, and at our little rentrée party that we had, I had an occasion to introduce 2 colleagues who I like very much, Tamara Tripakova, who's the spokesman for the Ukrainian embassy in Brussels, and Oana Longescu, who's the spokesman for Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. And I made this introduction to Tamara. This is Oana, Oana, this is Tamara. And I told Oana, Oana, Tamara wants you to know, just as soon as NATO completes sufficient reforms, Ukraine is willing to join as an ally. So a little irony helps to start the day. Before we just jump right into the opening presentations from our panelists, I'll tell you a little bit about how you ended up with me and the chief Brussels correspondent. It's hard to believe, I bring my electronic brain with me, that it was 8 years ago almost that I was working for my hometown newspaper, the New York Times, based in Moscow. And on a Saturday night after dinner in Moscow, I was saying to my wife, you know, there's this protest that's happening tomorrow in Kiev. I don't know, should I go or not go? Not sure, will it be a big deal? And went to Kiev, and I think came home something like 7 months later, because of course Maidan was just getting underway. And the headline on that story was "Thousands Protest Ukraine's Rejection of Trade Pacts." If you want to know why Ukraine has found its way into the heart of the European Union, it's partly because people were on the street, tens of thousands, as this story said, marching to protest the government's decision to abandon the political and free trade agreements with the EU, waving European Union flags. They marched from Shevchenko Park through Maidan, Independence Square, onto European Square, Europejska Plosha, and I talked to, for example, one young woman, she said, for young people, the future is brighter with Europe. She had a sign that said, Europe equals the future of Ukraine. And that day I also met a guy I had never seen before and met before on the street, Stanislav, who was then a television host with Piatый Kanal with Channel 5. And he explained there to me that the situation in society is boiling. We don't know when is the time that the top will pop off. And of course we know the top did pop off. But one thing that Serhiy said, and of course we know he went on to become the spokesman for the president, explaining why everybody was so angry, is that it's a sign that Ukraine can lose its statehood, it can lose its independence, and if we lose our independence, we lose everything. Ukraine has been on the edge, but has not lost its independence, it has not lost its sovereignty, and we'll start with the Deputy Prime Minister, who will talk to us a little bit about her perspectives, again, on our eternal questions for Ukraine at the moment, politics and strategies on growth, socioeconomic stability, peace and security. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you so much. Your introductory remarks completely underline everything I planned to say in the very beginning. But you know, being here in Odesa, I also recollect the 2nd of May, the events which has been unfortunately taking place here when separatists were trying to develop the same scenario as it was done in Donetsk and Lugansk, and it has already been happening after the annexation of Crimea. And when I recollect these events in my memory and the times of Euromaidan, I think that this was exactly the time when the democracy won over autocracy. It is where the real voice of each and every human has been heard and has been appreciated as the highest value. So, and I'm particularly proud to be here as a Deputy Prime Minister for EU and NATO affairs, because whatever I do basically on a daily basis is inspired with the values I've been standing for back in time, 2013 and 14. And this is like some inner feeling that drives everything you do. So, and I'm of course particularly proud to be surrounded by many of such people in parliament, in government, and especially a president of Ukraine who has become the major driver of everything which is happening in our country, starting with the unblocking and boosting the reforms agenda, as many of people were mentioning today and the day before. But also, this is a very good moment and very big window of opportunity for our country. Not even talking about the window of opportunity for EU and NATO affairs, but this is the window of opportunity we have opened 7 years or even 6 years after the Euromaidan inside of our country to transform, to mobilize this unity, this energy, this unique political momentum where the government, the parliament and the president are united And from this unity, we started to plan. And if we're talking about Ukraine 2030, we already have the feeling that we have put on the very good basis for seeing Ukraine the prosperous, the European, open and democratic country, which we always wanted to see 7 years ago, and we see right now. And the very important shift, I think, has happened over the last 2 years, and mostly over the last year. We finally have put aside our political debates, which are very much, popular in Ukraine, because still we're not part of a larger European or transatlantic community. So from elections to elections, our country is transforming. But this sustainable trend of European and democratic development has preserved, and it's important for us to do whatever we can in these 2.5 years before the election cycle to make sure that nothing will change, and in 2030 our country will look the same as we were dreaming to see 7+ years ago. So we're taking this momentum, I think, and we're taking the full advantage of this internal momentum in this country. But speaking about what is expected, I think that we're already in a very good shape when we're talking about our European and Euro-Atlantic affairs. It is really important that Ukraine is now, as I often say, is not on the menu but over the table. We have significantly contributed to the discussions related to energy security in Europe. And it wasn't like the voice of Ukraine. Ukraine has again been speaking on behalf of the whole European security because of having this unfortunate experience of the blackmailing and knowing the price of hybrid warfare Russia puts on our territory on a military basis, but also on the hybrid elements. Ukraine has also have reiterated its European choice by launching the full-scale green transformation and aligning itself with the green agenda, which has been a very complicated but important political and positive message from our country, showing that the commitment is there not only in tough times, but also in a time when it comes to the forming joint agenda and development and many other areas. So it's a great privilege of having this understanding that we are heard, that our voice is taken into account on the policy planning processes. But it's really important for us, I think, to see really a strong leadership from European Union and NATO when it comes to giving the answers to complicated questions. And it's not only the question basically of enlargement, it's about seeing the leadership in those issues which require the answers, the radical answer. And now we see this leadership when it comes to the energy security and the basically rule of law in European Union and those issues related to the Nord Stream 2. And we see that it is not the reflection, it's a proactive position, a proactive debate, and it inspires us to contribute even more and to do even more. So this is the leadership, and it brings a lot of hope into hearts of our Ukrainian politicians. This leadership will also be retranslated to the further reforms which will bring the clarity in policies of enlargement, both of European Union and NATO, because it requires really a leadership. And to complete my short remarks, I keep on recollecting our discussion with Mati Masikas a couple of months ago about the security in the Balkans region, and now this message is and the role EU played in stabilizing this region generally. And in the recent time, the discussion is boosting again that enlargement perspective is really important to bring more stability in the region. But the same narrative is basically applicable to Eastern Europe, and I think it's even more important to see a strong leadership of European Union over the democratic transformations and stability in the whole region.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard some buzz phrases that we'll come back to: leadership, energy security, enlargement. Only the European Commission could be up next. The Vice President, Margaritis, Schinas, take it away.
Thank you, David, Deputy Prime Minister, Governor, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start on a personal note. It has been for some time that the Boumbouras Foundation was insisting that I come to the Odesa debate, and for at the very last moment, something happened that I couldn't make it. But I'm delighted that finally I'm here on such an important year for the Odesa debate, a year that Ukraine celebrates its 30th anniversary, independence, but also a year that for us Greeks is very special, as this year we celebrate the bicentenary of the liberation and the start of the revolution that led to the modern Greek state. And Odesa probably is a place where these two landmarks meet. Odesa, for us Greeks, is a sacred place, as Pandelis said, a place that is part of our DNA. This is where the friendly society started, the first dreamers that conceived and organized the Greek Revolution. But it's also a place, the Prime Minister knows it well, that has always been a multicultural crossroads of different cultures, ideas that fertilize what we now know as the European way of life. But equally for Ukraine, I think this year is special, of the 30th year anniversary from the independence. Because of course it takes us back to what happened here. I beg to differ a bit with the Deputy Prime Minister and David, who said this was a place where people were carrying simply EU flags, protesting for democracy. The right way to put this is that this is the only place, the only country in Europe where people were killed for showing EU flags. This is the only place in the European geography where people were shot at because they were in the streets wrapping themselves in EU flags. So this is a story that should not be forgotten. This is not something that happened just like that in a political or in a geopolitical vacuum and vanished since. This should be a constant reminder of where we are coming from and why the European Union has a deep, intensive, genuine interest in this country and in the prospects of this country. Now, having said that, I think the starting point from a European perspective is that there is no other partner in the world with whom the European Union has more intense cooperation and commitment. Simply there isn't. Our ambassador here, Mati Masikas, is nodding approvingly. He should be very proud because he is in charge of a diplomatic delegation here that clearly testifies to our commitment to Ukraine. And this commitment is not unidimensional, does not cover some parts. It covers all the components of the current modern Ukrainian society and economic perspectives. We have a very robust and consequential macroeconomic assistance. We have an association agreement. We have a new joint statement that will bring this cooperation to new height. We are present on the ground trying to stabilize and assist the government and the state and the administration. We have visa-free travel, which should not be considered as a simple thing, and if some of you do, please ask your neighbors of how they go about it. We had 12 days ago a productive EU-Ukraine summit where we added yet more areas of cooperation, like the participation of Ukraine in our common aviation area, the participation of Ukraine in our flagship research program Horizon Europe, and the participation of Ukraine to our Creative Europe program that supports audiovisual and digital creators. So, to put it simply, in the sake of these opening remarks that David asked us to be short, the water is boiling in the area of EU-Ukrainian cooperation and association, and this of course covers our unwavering European commitment to stand by Ukraine in defense of its national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and geopolitical relevance in a world which, let's face it, is becoming increasingly unsafe, unsecure, darker than we wanted it to be. Now, having said all this, of course, and since this is a debate amongst friends, as in all intense relationship, there is also a level of expectations attached to a relationship. And we, the European Union, the Commission in particular, we very much hope and we insist that Ukraine stays the course of reform. This is a process that never stops. I like the way the Deputy Prime Minister put it. He said, from election to election, we are becoming better. That's precisely what we're looking for, a reform dynamics that is not diluted, that is ambitious, that accompanies and backs with political clout things that are necessary in this country, both in the economy and society and in the areas that we have identified. Now, looking ahead, there are also dark clouds in the horizon that affect us both, the European Union and Ukraine. We have ample evidence of malicious influence, of hybrid attacks, of disinformation, of instrumentalization and weaponization of migratory flows. We have a new type of an emerging threats landscape which concerns us both and against which we both need to organize common defenses. And the final area that I see also as a positive perspective in our relationship, which is often overlooked, I think, in the many and very regular contacts we're having between the two blocs, is what I would like to call people-to-people contacts. I mean, this is a country that it clearly lives in a way that is the European way and aspires to a European future which is fully justified. But we need to facilitate this by building the necessary fertilizers, if you like, catalysts that would allow people to know people better. Of course, we have some success with the Erasmus Plus programs. We have almost 12,000 Ukrainians who have used Erasmus scholarships to go into the European Union. About 6,000 EU nationals that came here for Erasmus, but this is a good start, but we have to do much better. And we have now doubled the amount of money for Erasmus programs in the years to come. Of a total of 20, we brought it from 10 to 22 billion euros, so more than double. And I would like very much to seize this occasion, also we'll discuss with the Deputy Prime Minister later, to boost this people-to-people chapter in our cooperation. I think this is important. And likewise, people to people should also be understood as creating the opportunities for more than diplomats, officials, and technocrats to meet and cooperate. We need churches, we need society, we need NGOs. So let me finish by saying that as far as I'm concerned and with my responsibilities within the Commission, I engage here solemnly to work as much and as best I can across these policy areas.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. So before we get to the people-to-people contacts right here in this room with questions, a few opening remarks from Stanislav Raščan, Minister for Development Cooperation from Slovenia, which currently has the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And in thanking the organizers, I would also like to share with you a story which I shared with some of you yesterday at the dinner. So exactly 200 years ago, in 1821 spring, Ljubljana Congress happened. So it was continuation of Vienna Congress, which was dividing Europe once again after Napoleon Wars. So all important leaders came to Ljubljana, as they did also this year. So it was Russian Tsar, it was the Bavarian King, it was Austro-Hungarian Emperor, it was Metternich, who was of course working behind the scene very hard, because he said that there was no enough ballrooms in Ljubljana to dance, so they were working very hard. But very interesting, the foreign minister of Russia was a certain Mr. Kapodistrias. He was born in, or his family came from Koper, Kapodistria in Slovenia, a beautiful port and town. And the decision, one of the important decisions of this Ljubljana Congress in Slovenia was independent Greece. So Mr. Kapodistrias became governor, first prime minister of Greece, and this is somehow connecting our two friendly nations and countries forever. We regained independence 30 years ago in Slovenia, but this shows how a small country like Slovenia can be facilitator, can be platform to work with others. But I was also this morning joking with somebody that it takes two to tango, but he answered me that in EU it takes 27 to tango, you know. So you need to understand how hard it is, of course, for the Commission, but also for the presidency of the Council of European Union to bring together all the voices in every decision. So we were working very hard to get some important decisions on the summit of the Western Balkan. So it was a successful meeting. All leaders from European Union and from Western Balkan came to Ljubljana to discuss the issue, and the enlargement process is on, which is great for everybody. And our second important meeting is Eastern Partnership meeting and EU, which will be held on the 15th of December in Brussels. So we are supporting, of course, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, who are working more advanced than, let's say, Azerbaijan and Armenia. And unfortunately, Belarus suspended their activity in Eastern Partnership, but we are trying to be engaged with these democratic politicians, oppositions from Belarus. We try to be engaged with the non-governmental organizations from Belarus, so not to forget them and not to let them be out of the of the path towards the European Union. On the Ukraine, I can only confirm what the Vice President said, about the important task we have in this people-to-people exchange. Also, we as Slovenia are trying very hard, and we did establish some local community exchange. So mayors, leaders of local community are coming to Slovenia. Our experiences, our way handling with the minority issues of not only minorities, Hungarians living in Slovenia, but Slovenians living in Hungary, and on the other side, Italians living in Slovenia, and Slovenians living in Italy. So this is a good example and good presentation of not only local authorities, but also how we are handling some special issue. And yeah, it's very important, this youth exchange, because this is our future, and we should really work on this. So once again, I'm looking forward that we are reaching one and good joint declaration at the end of the Eastern Partnership Summit. But for me, for us as a presidency of the Council of European Union, it's also important that this summit finally happens. Because of the pandemic. We are postponing for, 2-3 years, but for sure 4 years we did not have the summit, because we clearly saw also during the summit with Western Balkan that the good thing was that the summit happened, and additionally to this we made some good decisions on the summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So maybe to start our questions, I'm going to fast forward 200 years to a different conference gathering in Ljubljana, which was a Western Balkan summit just a couple of weeks ago of the European Council. And there, the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, said the Commission's message is very clear. First of all, the Western Balkans is part of the same Europe as the European Union. We share the same history, we share the same interests, the same values, and I'm deeply convinced, the same destiny. And then we had another gathering in Kiev for the EU-Ukraine summit, and the Commission President said there, we have come as friends and partners because we know that we share the same history, we share the same values, being convinced that the rule of law is our foundation, and I think we share the same destiny as one European family. So the question is, should Ukraine be ecstatic? Should the Balkans be depressed? Do we see the same European perspective for these territories? But more seriously, there's an opportunity here. Everyone sees a lot of goodwill on the European side of the EU, on the Ukrainian side, but a sense that maybe this window will stay open indefinitely. And some others are not convinced that's the case. So are things moving fast enough? When the EU often says more for more, sometimes the reaction in Ukraine is, how about, or maybe in the Balkans, something for something. Is it moving quick enough? Are both sides meeting in their obligations fast enough? So when we talk about what do Ukraine's partners expect, we also need to remember what do the Ukrainian people expect. Any of our panelists wish to jump in?
I would not be the first.
The way David is looking at me implies that I should be the first. And probably let's start dealing with this question by attempting to bridge the two historic settings with a time lapse of 200 years, right? When the Ljubljana Congress took place, and Kapodistrias, who was from Koper, Istria, and the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Tsar, was groomed to be the first leader of the modern state. A few years ago in this city, in Odesa, the Friendly Society had already led the foundations of a historic process. So then, same now, historic processes do not happen just like that, with a flick of a finger. There is no button to push where history accelerates. This is always a process. It has always been a process. And we Europeans, and I intentionally use the we, we have to take this factor this into our political thinking and create a certain level of expectations that cancels against this dramatic, apocalyptic development. So we have a meeting, we have a Western Balkan summit, so enlargement is under portas. It doesn't work like that. This is a process, this is a historical sequence. What does work is that when it comes to Europe being a family and sharing the same ecosystem of values, principles, this is irreversible. There is no way that we reverse what we have been building together, of the Western Balkans to Ukraine, this notion of a broader Europe that is based on the same values, principles, concept of life. And David, you also lived the financial crisis and these dramatic European councils and ECOFIN and Eurogroup meetings where even the fact that ministers would meet, or heads of state and government would meet, would create huge market expectations and worldwide fluctuations of currencies. And we lived this, and this is a model that doesn't suit us. Let me put it in terms of a soundbite. When we discuss these issues, we need less drama, and we need more macroscopic view, more sort of to take the broader picture into consideration. And if one takes the broader picture into consideration, there is no doubt whatsoever, that the process of a Europe that will be more and more united, and at the end of which there will be full accession from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, is something that is going to happen. But it's going to happen as a result of this sequence and of this process. It's not going to happen by decree, and it's not happen by an accelerator button. That's how.
And I think this inevitability, the way you described it, this inevitability is encouraging on one level, but also, as you pointed out, Ukrainians died wrapped in the European Union flag. And for some, that's a reason to be maybe a little bit impatient. Or to give an example of a briefing that we journalists had before the most recent EU-Ukraine summit, and one of which said, we need to see the reforms, for example, the judicial reforms in Ukraine become irreversible. And some of us who are paid to not behave so well say, so irreversible like in Poland, or irreversible like in Hungary.
Irreversible like in Ukraine, yes?
Irreversible like in Ukraine. Maybe, Madam Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, you could talk to us a little bit about how impatient are Ukrainians becoming? Not just the Ukrainian government, but or am I misreading that? Does everybody think it's moving at just the right pace?
Well, I have just two remarks on that. As a Deputy Prime Minister for EU NATO Affairs, I'm constantly under pressure to invent something unbelievable, to make sure that EU will invent something unbelievable to give the immediate answers to those questions, which are really the process, and we were really discussing it in the same way on the summit. But knowing the historical reality and the context and how the policies are made, I understand that basically there are no miracles, but there's one thing that we should all understand. Basically, our relations with the European Union and the whole world look like a solar system, whereas the sun is the threats and challenges we all face. And we all have the common understanding how does that look. But for Ukraine, one solar year is 365 days. But for Neptunus, which is European Union, it's like 80 years. So we do it like that. And you have much more time to be in a process. But in Ukraine, the aspirations and this process is really dependent. And we have only a year after year, which is the political cycle after political cycle, to make sure that the country is stable and democratic. So there's no miracles, and if there's any investment that could be done in our country, the leadership and the signals which could be brought to our country to make these democratic transformations irreversible, they're not now lying within Ukraine, while we're doing a lot to make sure that the dynamics and momentum of the reforms to be preserved. And I think that there has been a huge number of times where Ukraine has reiterated this commitment, was something which I've been mentioning before, but also with the radical steps taken towards the reform of judiciary. And there's a clear understanding of the president that he has a very short period of time not to be in the same trap all the presidents before him were, where the momentum wasn't preserved and something wasn't completed. So things should be completed by the end of this political term. But it's really important that it's not only Ukraine who's in charge of freezing these democratic transformations. It is the whole Europe, and it is in the interest of the whole Europe. While Ukraine is really very much resilient towards Russian hybrid and military aggression, this should not be again treated as a normality, as Vice President was saying, because we have been standing on Maidan, we have been fighting Russian aggression, and although it's not the process which ends in one day with the membership in EU and NATO or a resolution of the conflict in the Donbass, it lasts already for the 7 years, but the dynamics is the same. The emotion is the same, and the answers we're waiting are clear for us, but I think it's also a two-way street.
And Minister Raščan, you mentioned that in December 15th, there'll be an Eastern Partnership Summit, finally again in Brussels. And important for us to remember that, in fact, everything that has transpired in recent Ukrainian history began with this refusal by the former President Yanukovych to sign the association agreement and the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement at the Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius. Remember this moment when the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was in his face. There's a great video that the Lithuanians put out about it saying, we expected more. We also saw in Batumi this summer the three presidents together, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, and there President Zarabashvili of Georgia said, we have a lot in common, a common past, common challenges to our sovereignty and territorial integrity, common challenges to our security, and these destabilization attempts that can come from outside forces as well as from inside forces. Is there a plan, to your mind, for the succession of the Eastern Partnership Program? What comes next? Now that we've reached this stage where Belarus, as you point out, has dropped out, where you have three countries that want to move forward and are facing challenges, will we see a sort of multi-speed Eastern Partnership where three are moving ahead together? Do you see, what's your perspective on where the Eastern Partnership goes from here?
If I may go back to history a little bit, of course I agree with the Vice President, is irreversible progress, because 30 years ago we had so-called 10 days war in Slovenia, so also we were dying in the street of Ljubljana, fighting for European Union and for NATO. We were demonstrating for a few years before, or at least a couple of years before, for having opportunity to join European Union and NATO. This was also force behind our independence. And then for 10 years we did not have diplomatic relations with Milosevic Yugoslavia, or better to say Serbia, and we were, so deeply disappointed 1997 when we did not join NATO with Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Slovenia and Slovakia were left out. Slovakia because of Mečiar, Slovenia because of some geopolitical things. but it was irreversible. So when I'm looking now back, of course it was painful for the country who was fighting for the democracy. We had a war for democracy, and after 7 years or after 6 years, we were not rewarded, I still remember how disappointed we were in the foreign ministry, in the public opinion, and so on. But when I look back now, okay, we did our job, we overcome the disappointment, and we joined the NATO then after 4 years without any problems. So, yeah, every country should follow, and just short mentioning also Croatia, who was even in a bigger problem, 4 years war, and all others, and also they prolonged their accession to EU and NATO, but they succeeded, because this was their main goal of all and every politician, political party, almost every political party, and society as whole, So I see this, as I said also at the beginning, Eastern Partnership definitions now, everybody should do, every country should do on their own, but on the other side, they should also work together as much as they can. We, let's say, established at that time in the 90s, so-called Central European Free Trade Agreement. So, we were learning how to work together and how to approach the regulations of European Union. Now we see also on the Western Balkan that they are doing their mini Schengen, that they are doing also free trade agreements and so on. This is important, that every and each country is showing by itself to their population, to their people, and also to everybody else, that they are willing to do, that they are willing, just to go through reforms, anti-corruption, and so on, because they are doing for themselves, but that they are willing to share also with the region, with the neighboring countries. So from our side, as a presidency of the European Union, Council of European Union, as a country of European Union, we are trying to help as much as we can to Ukraine, to Moldova, to Georgia. So by the size of our country and others, of course, maybe in Ukraine our help and our achievement is not so visible, but in other countries is a little bit more visible. But once again, Siamic capital of Armenia, Azerbaijan should not be left out, We need to work with them also, and we are really trying, not let them out. And when Madam Tikhanovskaya is coming to Slovenia or to other capitals, of course, we cannot left out Belarusian people, They are also suffering, they are in jails, they were also beaten and so on the streets, because they were also having European flags, they are also chanting for European Union, because this is the way they see as a path towards democracy, better life, and better life for young people. So I'm now almost 60, but I was also 30, and these days of the Slovenian independence movement were the best days of my life.
So I hear that our panelists are all optimists today, and I'll tell you my favorite turn on the phrase. The pessimist sees the glass as half empty, the optimist sees the glass as half full, and the engineer says the glass is twice as big as necessary for optimum use of resources. So let's figure out how to solve the problems. Maybe one more question from me before we open it up to our audience, and this is about stability in Ukraine from a financial standpoint. The EU and the IMF have come in with generous packages. Sometimes folks forget, though, out of the 17 billion promised by the EU, barely 10% of that is in grants. Most of that is in loans, and what's been repaid so far includes 2.7 billion in interest alone. deal with the IMF last week that may reopen some 600 million in assistance. But again, a question of, and maybe we'll start with the Deputy Prime Minister, there are tough questions for lenders in these situations, but also the borrowers. Is Ukraine borrowing too much? Is it taking on a burden for future generations that it may not be able to manage?
I think that there's an important element which brings me back again to the topic I've been mentioning before over my speech, that we preserve the stability of financial system over the last, 7 years. And basically, right now, we have one of the most advanced processes of cooperation with IMF in terms of the predictability, trust, and let's say frankness in our election, because we have never been promising something we would not be ready to deliver on. The same goes to macro-financial assistance and cooperation with the EU in this regard. So it is a very tough process, to be frank, and to be tough when you are self-committing to deliver on some agenda. And then it is really important for us how they say in Odesa, if you want to agree on something, you should agree before you go swimming. So this is exactly the logic which we have been using whenever we launched any discussions with financial institutions. We didn't want to be nice and fluffy and look like more reformers than we can, so we have been agreeing on something we're really committed to do. This is a tough process, but still by the end of the day it brings a lot of stability, trust, and mutual respect through the relations. But I think the other important really development that we finally started to put a lot of substance and system into the general approach to the management of state finances. We've introduced a 3-year budgetary planning, and that really brings a lot of clarity in terms of aligning policies with the financial allocations. So it's again a very long-lasting process, but I think positive element of that is that we have gained the trust as the reliable borrower, so-called, but from the other side, we're doing our best to make sure that those finances and resources we already have, we manage properly, and that brings its, let's say, results, as Governor Hrynevetsky was mentioning. This is the program of big reconstruction, the huge allocations to the COVID fund, and basically all those reforms which have been approved by Ukrainian parliament, they have been properly financed, including 50% of Ukrainian budget, which is allocated through the decentralization reform to the regions. So we're now still far from the perfect picture, but we are in a very good process.
Mr. Vice President, you pointed out the Commission has ample experience with debt crisis management. Do you worry at all about, in some ways, that it's unavoidable, the needs are so great, and yet
one of the things that I wouldn't like to do is lecture Ukraine. In fact, I don't want to lecture anybody. But probably I could recall in my mind that when in the European Union we made the mistake, because it was a mistake, to bring the IMF into the governance of the EMU, something that under no circumstances would happen now or will happen ever in the future. It was clear that the IMF could not understand the complexities of the European monetary union, because it was the first time for them as well to work in an environment of a currency union. They were saying things that I still recall, things like, you guys in Europe, you always have elections someplace. And they couldn't realize why the European Central Bank would sit with them and not on the other hand. Anyway, to cut a long story short, one of the few good things that I learned from their involvement, which is something that probably can apply to anyone who has dealings with them, is that if there is one thing that they don't like, is the over-promising and under-delivery. And I think that this is the real test when you deal with the international monetary institutions and the IMF in particular, they're very happy to take a level of commitment if they're sure that this commitment would be complied upon. And knowing well as I do the main political actors in this country involved, I have no doubt that they know what it takes to keep the ship steady.
The lesson I'm hearing is that who you borrow from might be almost as important as how much you borrow. Turning to our audience, questions from you. I'm going to open it up. We have a few minutes to take questions. Let's get started right here in the front. Please introduce yourselves too when you can. We have microphones coming around.
My name is Nikki Zavella from the Boumbouras Foundation. The question is the following. Before we get to the issue of joining, can we see the issue of connecting the Western Balkans, the corridors of transport and energy are within the pan-European network of transport and energy? What about Ukraine? Have you been included in the network of transport and energy of the pan-European plan? That's my question, because connectivity comes first, and then we have the joining. Thank you.
We heard about the recent civil aviation agreement at just this summit, but anybody want to comment further on transportation connections?
If I only may just outline it from our perspective, this is exactly the priority we put for the upcoming years, the connectivity and logistics, and it is really a complicated process. And just yesterday we were in Ismail with the governor, right at the shore of the river Danube, and there are like two good news. There is a lot of potential to be revealed in terms of transportation. We've adjusted our legislation and aligned it with the UN, so we can use Danube as the transportation corridor in line with the old standards and etc. And our rivers are already included into the networks, into the transportation networks. But there's also a bad part of the story that we've lost 30 years of undeveloped infrastructure. And this is a very bad lesson learned by our government and seen by me physically yesterday. If we have invested in our infrastructure, then the Danube River would be one of the most prospective corridors for transportation, not only from Ukraine to Europe, but also to Asia. But we really have been losing this opportunity for decades. And hopefully our internal transformations will boost this connectivity. But I think that this is the area where I would say Ukraine still has to do a lot to become the fully fledged participant of all the supplies chains.
More questions from our audience?
Thank you very much. Ilya Gusa, Ukrainian Institute for the Future. There is a huge discussion in the expert community in Ukraine, and I would be very interested to hear thoughts of our panelists on this. Do you think is the concept of enlargement and on a more broader basis, so huge integration projects that, like the European Union and many in other regions, is actually possible in the modern age, which appears to be more characterized by economic nationalism, prevailing of national interests, migration-related ideological rifts, and what appears to be post-COVID social and economic grievances that shook the very relationship between the governments and societies. So do you think in this environment, is enlargement and integration projects are at the table still?
I think it's enlargement in the age of Brexit question, but there are no Brits on our panel, so it's safe. Go ahead.
No, I think the obvious and very clear answer to this question is a resounding yes, it is. And if you look around us, I mean, what are we to expect in the years to come, since you represent an institute for the future? Look around you. What are the drivers that will shape our world in the years to come, in these post-pandemic years to come? First, there will be a universal quest for resilience and protection. People would need to feel safe, be it within safe borders, be it with vaccines, be it with personal protective equipment, be it with recovery instruments and economic stabilization. So this is the first quest. L'Europe qui protège, as Emmanuel Macron would put it in Sorbonne. Second driver, and this is happening already, is the so-called twin transition, the greening of our economy and the digitalization of our economy and our society. This is happening already, but the speed that we'll see in the years to come is beyond any imagination. A greener world, it's probably something that we can imagine already. In Europe, nobody buys a diesel car anymore. The EIB does not finance any fossil energy projects. We do not buy plastic. So this is happening. But the digital transformation will be even faster. And we will reach a point of algorithms, of acceleration, of the Internet of Things that will be a new galaxy, a new constellation. So the obvious question, when these are the drivers that await us, is would we be better alone in facing those, or together with others? I think that you will find very few people in Europe claiming that alone they can cope better. And I'm not talking about the proud nations of Slovenia, Greece, Croatia, or middle-sized players, or like Belgium. I'm talking Germany, I'm talking Spain, I'm talking France. These need to work with others to be able to build resilient and cohesive societies for the future is written on the wall all over Europe. And probably that's one of the few good things that the pandemic taught us, that from vaccines to the digital COVID certificate, no one can make it alone. So I very much hope that this country is no exception to the trend. There will always be the Cassandras, the doomsayers, the catastrophologists, if such a word exists, if not I just invented it. There will always be people pushing to the narrative we're better alone. But historically, philosophically, but also socioeconomically, this would not stand anymore in our times.
And as you heard from my questions, I'm paid to share the skepticism, but having covered Brexit these last few years, if you ask me, do the folks in Brussels prefer the accession and enlargement process or the Brexit process? For sure, they prefer the club and growing, not shrinking.
And you appreciated my discretion on this side.
I'm doing it for you. We have with us General Ben Hodges, who has a question, former commander of U.S. Army Europe. Please.
Thanks, David. Good morning. My question will be to Vice President Schinas. Sir, 2 days ago, another Ukrainian soldier was killed by Russian forces. This has been going on since day one of the so-called ceasefire. And I just, what is the Commission doing to put pressure on the Kremlin to stop this? When Madi said yesterday, and I appreciate it, his number one wish was to stop all the fighting, to stop the killing. So what is the Commission, can the Commission do to help bring that about? Because the current process doesn't seem to be working. Thanks, sir.
Well, I don't think that I'm breaking any news here by telling you that the Commission is not and is not a military or defense entity. We do not have a European army. We do not have European air carriers or fighter planes. So we are what we are. We are a union of 27 democracies, operating the biggest single market in the world. We have the second world currency of reference. We have extensive common policies across the policy spectrum. But the two things that we still do not have, one is a common foreign and defense identity, and a common European taxation system. And it's not an accident that these two things are on our to-do list, because these are areas where we're very close to the heart of the national sovereignty, and member states prefer to organize themselves when it comes to tax individually, and when it comes to defense collectively, mainly by NATO. Now, events around us, not only Ukraine, but also in Afghanistan and elsewhere, point out the need for Europe to gradually build our own defense identity. We Europeans need to convince ourselves that there will not always be someone to hold an umbrella for us to go and protect ourselves. We need to start thinking in terms of creating our own umbrella, and an umbrella big enough that will cover not only ourselves but also the family, the extended family, including this part of the world. But this again will not happen overnight. This will not happen by some sort of a regulation or a directive. There will be no von der Leyen battalions to leave Brussels to be dispatched from one day to the other. But we have already triggered a sequence that one day can take us there. First, we are now coordinating our defense industry, and we try to converge in establishing types of weapons and systems, defense systems that are financed by the EU budget, and push our member states also in terms of public procurement around more European buys, if you like. We're also seeing increasingly a wave of defense cooperation agreements between our member states in Europe that could be the embryo of a broader European defense identity. And we see something else. We see a world that is so unsafe and so threatening to our interest that this is a compelling factor for us to go fast. In the evacuation of our people from Afghanistan, something, by the way, on which I want to congratulate compliment Ukraine for being one of the few nations that were able to fly flights out from Afghanistan. Then we saw the very sad spectacle of our member states trying to organize flights amongst themselves, whereas the Americans, with just 3,000, 5,000 troops in the airport, managed to do it effectively for their own people. What does this say? That says that we need some sort of a rapid reaction force. We need sort of a European defense capacity that would allow us to mobilize in times of crisis, in times where the European Union interest, strategic interest is threatened. And we are now working very actively on that. My colleague, Josep Borrell, the High Representative, is finalizing what he calls the strategic compass, which will be discussed by the defense minister. So I'm sorry that I cannot offer some sort of immediate relief in situations like the one that we're experiencing in this part of Europe, but I can offer again a sense of perspective. The way our policy will develop in the years to come will certainly lead to a situation where Europe will emerge with a defense identity.
I see Bruno is ready to, with the microphone, to tell me we're out of time. I just want to say thank you for the reminder. You know, Ukraine is still a country at war. There's a hot war in Europe, and although it isn't the Commission's place, certainly the two most powerful and influential EU member states, France and Germany, are the guarantors of the Normandy process. And some of us push that question all the time. Is this process working? Is it moving fast enough? I want to thank our panelists for a great, I think, Bruno, we're out of time, or do we have time for one more? Okay, let's take one more question. I see a waving enthusiastic hand. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you.
And we'll wrap up.
I'm Odesa, member of the European Parliament. My question goes also to Vice President of the Commission. I think the distinguished general asked not about the European defense capacities, but he asked about political will of condition to press Moscow. For time being, we see how the separate member states, despite the verbal condemnation over Russia's aggression, I would say organizing profitable business with Russia, despite these all so-called sanctions. And knowing that the Commission's competence also lies on EU trade policy, I think that this is a question, was what the General had in mind, that we need and we lack of a Commission desire to take a more tough stance on EU trade, EU member trade with Russia. Because otherwise, it looks like that we are pouring money to the aggressors' pockets. Thank you.
Well, I was the Chief Commission spokesman for 5 years, and one of the things that I learned to develop is to reply to the questions I'm asked for. and this is a different question from the one the General asked, but I'm happy to tackle it. It is not the role of the Commission, of course, to substitute for member states investment, I would say, moves or commercial moves or business moves. But yes, you're absolutely right. Trade policy is an EU competence, and this is within our remit as guardians of the treaty to make sure that overall the trade policy of the European Union is taken on a community basis. And this is very much the case with Russia, as it is with all our trading blocs. Yes, I do not live in an exoplanet. I live in this planet, and I do know that, of course, some of our member states have eclectic or selective arrangements on in certain areas, not all of which are of EU competence. I would say most of them are outside of the EU competence. So our role is not to police individual member states' decisions. That cannot be done. But it is to police everything that the member states have agreed to do as a union. And when it comes to that, you know that the sanctions on Russia are very much in application. They are renewed, they're extended. And this is our role, to make sure that everything that pertains to what we decided sanction against Russia and other parts of the world, of course, is respected. So I do understand this argument. I can sense the frustration, but the Commission can only do with what the treaties allow us specifically to do. We cannot sort of substitute national decisions.
A very small comment from my side. I think the questions which has been Ben and the Lithuanian colleague putting should be also considered from the Russian perspective. So what EU and US and many allies have done when the annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression started, together with the partners, we managed to form the international unity over illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia being a party to a military aggression on our territory. Severe sanctions were implied, and Australia and many countries out of European continent joined these sanctions. This was the part of the story, the lesson learned by Russia, that whereas there is a unity, there's no room for Russia to put the rules on the table. What they started to do, as they do on a daily basis, they started to adjust to new reality, and they started to undermine this unity from within, going capital by capital. And this is what you're referring to. So what is important is to preserve this unity, to adjust to the policies Russians are doing, and to keep this pressure, and to keep holding Russia accountable. And this also brings us to thinking of the new instruments, whereas they keep on adjusting to those reality. And the new human rights sanctions mechanism, which has been applied by European Union, is also a very small but very important dimension. And Ukraine has already submitted proposals for sanctioning those Russian officials in Crimea and in Moscow, basically, for the violation of human rights, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, for the violation of human rights following recent elections in State Duma, and basically we should not underestimate the voice of the European Union. When European Union is coming with a statement on non-recognitions of elections in Crimea, it has its implication. It's not a military protection, it's not supply of weapons or something else, but it is a voice which is really important and heard. So, of course, as a Ukrainian, as a Ukrainian politician, I want this strong voice to be there at each and every moment, whereas there is injustice or a violation of our sovereignty or territorial integrity or human rights is taking place.
I would just add, as somebody who's a close watcher of the European institutions, to look back at the spring conclusions of the European Council, which we saw something very interesting transpire, where Germany and France were pushing the idea of a summit with Vladimir Putin, and Lithuania, one of the smaller member states, taking the lead, turned those conclusions around, and the result was maybe some of the most Russia-realistic conclusions I would say we've seen come out of a European Council summit. And so there is an interesting evolution happening where I think there is more cohesion, perhaps more consistency, as the 27 still do have to tango when it comes to policies towards Moscow. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Thanks to the organizers. We're on for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much, David. We are pünktlich at the German Marshall Fund, but for good conversations, we like to build in overtime. Please don't go anywhere. We have a back